Welcome to Philippine Indigenous Communities. In this video, we will discuss about the social situation of the indigenous peoples during the Spanish contact. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to examine the social situation of indigenous peoples during the Spanish contact. Spanish explorers were not the first to reach and discover the islands. Long before their arrival, the archipelago was home to numerous independent communities, each with its own social, political, and cultural systems. Understanding these early societies is supported by the wave migration theory, which explains how the peopling of the Philippines occurred in successive waves. The first migrants were the Negritos, believed to have arrived around 30,000 years ago. They were later followed by the Indigenous about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, who introduced more advanced tools and agricultural practices. The final major wave consisted of the Malays, arriving roughly 2,000 years ago, bringing with them more complex social structures, maritime technologies, and cultural traditions. Together, these waves of migration illustrate the deep ethnic diversity and rich cultural foundations that existed in the islands long before the Spanish contact. In addition, as early as 1000 AD, Chinese, Arabic, and Indian traders engaged in extensive commerce with our local populations. However, it was the Spanish government that bound thousands of islands under a single colonial rule. Yet the map that labeled Las Islas Filipinas as one unified territory concealed the vast ethno-linguistic diversity of the archipelago. Anthropological studies suggest that the area Spain claimed included more than 150 distinct cultural, ethnic, and linguistic groups. Within this colonial geography, Spain soon realized that effective governance was far more complex than drawing boundaries on a map. The great distance between Manila, which was the colonial center, and outlying regions, combined with challenging terrain and limited infrastructure, made centralized control difficult. As a result, many socially and geographically isolated communities retained significant elements of their indigenous traditions, experiencing Spanish influence unevenly and in varying degrees. Using the situation at the end of the Spanish regime as a frame of reference, the various communities in the Philippine archipelago may roughly be divided into two broad groupings: those who were colonized and those who were not. Those who were colonized generally belonging to the barangay communities, which compose the eight major groups of speakers in the Philippines. Meanwhile, those who were not may further be subdivided into those who fought and were subjugated, and those who successfully evaded contact with Spanish forces, thereby escaping colonization. Either way, they remained free throughout the period of Spanish colonization. We give focus on those who were unconquered by Spain. The first subgroup comprised the Muslim communities of Mindanao and Sulu, as well as the Igorot peoples of the Cordillera. The second subgroup included those who are today collectively referred to as tribal Filipinos or indigenous cultural communities and indigenous peoples. By an ironic turn of history, it was these unconquered and uncolonized groups, those who either resisted Spanish rule or successfully avoided colonial control, who later became to be labeled as the cultural minorities of the 20th century. But before we examine in detail how these groups eventually came to be regarded as cultural minorities, it is important to understand their social conditions at the time of Spanish contact. To do this, we turn to the work of Dr. William Henry Scott, a renowned scholar of Philippine history who studied the diverse societies that existed across the archipelago during the Spanish period. Scott identified several distinct social formations, each shaped by unique political, economic, and cultural characteristics. He classified these into barangay communities, Islamized communities, warrior societies, petty plutocracies, and classless communities. This framework helps us situate the different groups within the broader historical landscape and better understand why some were colonized while others remained beyond Spanish control. Let's start with the barangay communities. Barangays existed as the basic political unit of our ancestors even before the arrival of the Spaniards. In fact, the word barangay is derived from the Austronesian word balangay, which refers to a type of boat used by early Austronesian peoples for seafaring and migration. When these early settlers arrived in the Philippines, they formed a small kinship-based communities led by a chieftain, and the term balangay evolved to barangay to denote these local villages or communities. The barangays, which were basically clan communities, were associated with coastal settlements or those found at the mouth and banks of rivers, or simply lowland communities who a long time past brought themselves from the other islands of the Malay archipelago and Indonesia. Each barangay, consisting of several families acknowledging a common origin, was ruled by a patriarchal head or datu who led its people to war and settled their disputes according to the traditions handed down from their ancestors. Not all in the clan village had the same social status. There were those who were the equals of the datu in all respects save authority. There were the well-born or maharlika, bound to their lord by kinship and personal fealty, owing him aid in war and counsel in peace, but in all else free, possessing land and chattels of their own. There were the Timawa, who did not have the noble blood of the Maharlika, but were like them, free. The rest were alipin, less than free. Some alipin were serfs, called aliping namamahay, or literally housekeeping dependents, owning a house and personal property, but tilling the land of the datu or the well-born for a share of the crop and bound to the soil. Others are called aliping sa gigilid or household dependents. They were chattel slaves captured in war or reduced to bondage according to Malay custom for failing to pay a debt. Each barangay averaged from 30 to 100 families, was self-sustaining and independent from the others. Exceptions were trading centers like Cebu and Manila, the latter having been reported to have 1,000 families at Spanish contact. Next are the Islamized communities. The Muslim principalities were considered to be the most developed communities in the entire archipelago, having reached the level of centrally organized life. Leading the group was the Sultanate of Sulu, whose sultanate began as early as 1450. Though independent of each other at the time of the Spanish contact, the principalities of Maguindanao and Buwayan were united by Sultan Kudarat in 1619 into the Maguindanao Sultanate. The Islamized communities are traditional inhabitants of the southern portion of Mindanao, central Mindanao, the islands of Basilan and the Sulu archipelago, and southern Palawan. Islam first arrived in the Sulu archipelago towards the end of the 13th century, estimated to be in 1280 AD, brought by a certain Tuan Masyaika who apparently got married there and thus established the first Islamic community. Masyaika was followed by a Muslim missionary named Karim ul Makdum, also known as Sheikh Makdum Karim, around the second half of the 14th century. He established a mosque in Simunul Island in Tawi-Tawi, Philippines, known as Sheikh Karim ul Makdum Mosque, which is the oldest mosque in the country. In addition, Raja Baginda came at the beginning of the 15th century and introduced the political element in the Islamization process. It was his son-in-law Abu Bakr, whom he had designated as his successor, who started the Sulu Sultanate. We do not know what level of social development the people of Sulu reached in the 13th century. What we do know is that in 1417, a Sulu leader named Paduka Pahala, also known as Paduka Batara, led a trade expedition of 300 people to China. They were said to have presented a letter of gold within the characters engraved upon and offered pearls, precious stones, tortoiseshell, and other articles. Unfortunately, the Sultan had taken ill and died in Dojo, Shandong, China, on his way back to Sulu. Sultan Paduka Batara was given an elaborate imperial burial in China, as you can see in the lower picture. Islam came to Maguindanao with a certain Sharif Aulia from Johor around 1460. He is said to have married there, had a daughter, and left. He was followed by Sharif Maraha, also from Johor, who stayed in the Silangan area and married the daughter of Aulia. Around 1515, Sharif Kamusuan arrived with many men at the Silangan area, roughly where Malabang is now. He is generally credited with having established the Islamic community in Maguindanao and expanded through political and family alliances with the ruling families. Islam in Manila was a relative newcomer at the time of the Spaniards' arrival. There were reportedly 10 or 12 chiefs in the Manila Bay Area, each the acknowledged leader of their town, and one of them was the greatest and was obeyed by all. Next are the warrior societies. Like the barangays, the warrior communities were also kinship bound. Dr. Scott, who has done extensive studies on the matter, calls them warrior communities because they were characterized by a distinct warrior class in which membership is won by personal achievement, entails privilege, duty, and prescribed norms of conduct, and is requisite for community leadership. He adds that the major occasion for exercising military skill among these societies is during raids called mangayaw into unallied territory, but individual attacks are made by stealth or as opportunity presents itself, including suicidal one-man foray. Moreover, braves clear their own fields like everybody else, for which reason Mangayo raid tends to be seasonal, except among dependents and so qualify as a sort of a parasite class. Agricultural surplus is produced by increasing labor force through polygyny, sons-in-law, dependents by blood or death, or slaves. Their heirloom wealth necessary for high social status consists of imports like porcelain, brassware, and beads, or local manufactures like weapons and gold work. It is accumulated mainly through bride price, guild, and legal fees, and is thus more likely to be the result of personal power than the cause. Among those falling within this category were the Manobo, the Mandaya, the Bagobo, the Tagakaulo, the Blaan, and the Sobanon of Mindanao, also the Isneg, the Kalingas, and the Tingyan of Cordillera. Next are the petty plutocracies. Petty plutocracy refers to a societal system or governance structure where a small group of wealthy individuals hold significant power and influence, often using their economic resources to control or manipulate political and social systems for their own benefit. In a petty plutocracy, power is concentrated in the hands of a few, leading to potential inequalities and corruption within the community or organization they control. The petty plutocracies are confined only to the Cordillera Central in northern Luzon, more specifically to the Ifugao, Buntok, Kankanaoy, and Ibaloy. They were described as such because they are, Dr. Scott says, dominated socially and politically by a recognized class of rich men who attain membership through birthright, property, and the performance of specified ceremonies, and petty because of their authority is localized, being extended by neither absentee landlordism nor territorial subjugation. These are some of the pictures showing the ICC's IPs belonging to the petty plutocracies. Lastly, we have the classless communities. Classless societies are social systems in which there are no distinction or division based on social or economic class. In such societies, there is an absence of hierarchical structures that separate individuals based on factors like wealth, education, occupation, or inherited status. Everyone has equal access to resources, opportunities, and social privileges, aiming to eliminate inequality and promote social harmony. The classless communities, as Dr. Scott claims, are so characterized because they distinguish no class or group which exerts authority or advantage over other classes or subgroups by virtue of ascribed or acclaimed status. Very good examples of these were the Ilonggot of Northern Luzon, the Katalangan of Isabela, the Ikalangan of Nueva Vizcaya, the Mangyans of Mindoro, who are divided into distinct language groups, namely Iraya, Alangan, Tadyawan, Hanunuo, Buhid, Taubuyid, and Batangan. We also have the Batak of Palawan, the Tiruray of Maguindanao and Sultan Kudarat in Mindanao, the Sulod of Panay and the Negritos, who are known by different names. Generally Aita, Ita or Ita to the Tagalog, Baluga, Alta or Dumaga to the Tagalog of Baler, Atta to the Ibanag in Cagayan, Agya among the Isneg, Pugot meaning black or very dark colored to the Ilocano, also Kulot or curly to the Ilocano neighbors in Abra, Ata and Magahat in the island of Negros in the Visayas, Ata in Davao and Mamanwa in Agusan, Surigao. What must be stressed because it is taken for granted by so many people is in fact the Negritos have traditionally inhabited practically the entire stretch of the Philippine archipelago, from Cagayan southward along the entire stretch of the Sierra Madre to Camarines Norte, also in Zambales in west central Luzon, in Panay and Negros in the Visayas, and Agusan, Surigao, and Davao in Mindanao. Dr. William Henry Scott's classifications of classless communities helps illuminate the worldview of many indigenous peoples whose societies lack rigid hierarchies and centralized authority. In these communities, land and natural resources were not privately owned but were believed to belong to supernatural beings whose permission had to be ritually sought. As Scott explains, the land itself is the property of supernatural personalities, and wild forest products or game are under the protection of spirits, reflecting an indigenous worldview where the environment was treated with respect, reciprocity, and spiritual responsibility. These are some of the pictures of the indigenous communities that practices classless communities before and during the Spanish contact. We have the Ilonggot or Bugkalot. We also have the Mangyan and the Tiruray or Tiduray. A key takeaway from this discussion is that long before Spanish colonization, the Philippine archipelago was already home to a rich mixture of cultures, societies, and political systems shaped by centuries of interaction of our indigenous ancestors. These communities, whether organized as barangays, sultanates, warrior groups, petty plutocracies, or classless societies, were far from primitive or uniform. The diverse communities of our early indigenous peoples clearly disprove colonial claims that they were savages or illiterate. In reality, they possess their own sophisticated systems of leadership, belief, social organization, and environmental stewardship. Their ways of life were not inferior. They were simply different from the norms and structures that the colonizers were familiar with. In conclusion, Dr. William Henry Scott's classifications reminds all of us that Philippines' diverse indigenous societies developed independently, guided by their own cultural logic and environmental contexts. Spanish colonization did not create this diversity, it merely encountered it, embracing some groups, resisting others, and failing to penetrate many. Understanding these pre-colonial foundations allows all of us to appreciate the resilience of our indigenous peoples who preserve their cultural identities despite centuries of external pressures. It also highlights that what later came to be labeled as cultural minorities were, in fact, communities with deep, enduring histories that continue to shape our nation's cultural landscape today. These are some of the references I used in this discussion. That's all for Module 1, Lesson 4, and thank you very much for listening. Mabuhay ang mga katutubo and maraming salamat. Don't forget to take the quiz.